Millionaire left frozen upon discovering what the gardener did to his 8-year-old daughter. Gustavo Alcantara's mansion was a testament to opulence. Perched atop a hill surrounded by vast, meticulously maintained gardens, with fountains spilling crystal-clear water and an infinity pool that seemed to merge with the horizon, it was a reflection of his undeniable success. Gustavo was one of the country's most respected businessmen, known for his sharp business acumen and cold demeanor toward anyone daring to cross his path. He lived there with Sophia, his 8-year-old daughter. The girl, with her golden hair and lively eyes that seemed to mirror the clearest skies, was his greatest joy and his greatest vulnerability. Since the tragic death of his wife, Ana Luisa, in a car accident 3 years earlier, Gustavo had closed himself off from the world. He became even more devoted to his work, striving to provide Sophia with everything she could ever desire. Yet, despite his wealth and influence, there was something in Gustavo's gaze that hinted at a man wrestling with demons he wouldn't dare acknowledge. That morning, sunlight streamed through the glass windows of the grand living room, casting a golden glow across the marble floors. Gustavo was seated in a leather armchair in the garden, a steaming cup of coffee by his side and a tablet in his hands, reviewing figures from a recent contract. Sophia, as always, ran barefoot across the grass, laughing at something the wind seemed to have whispered in her ear. Her laughter always managed to make Gustavo smile, even if only for a fleeting moment before his usual seriousness returned. From a distance, he noticed Jamie, the new gardener, helping Sophia reach a yellow flower she was eagerly pointing at. Jamie had been working at the mansion for less than a month, hired on the recommendation of a longtime employee. He was a tall, robust man with calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. His eyes, however, carried an unsettling depth, as if they held secrets no one could fathom. He seems good with kids, Gustavo thought, watching as Jamie handed the flower to Sophia with a genuine smile. The girl held the flower as though it were a treasure and dashed off to the fountain, carefully placing it on the water and watching it float. Jamie stood still for a moment, arms crossed, before glancing in Gustavo's direction. Their eyes met briefly. The moment was short but uncomfortable. Jamie seemed to hesitate before nodding respectfully and returning to his work. Good gardener, but a bit odd, Gustavo murmured to himself before going back to his reading. Later that morning, as the sun reached its peak, Sophia approached her father with the yellow flower in hand. She gently placed it on his tablet, interrupting his focus. "For you, Daddy," she said, smiling brightly. Gustavo picked her up and twirled her in the air, something he rarely did, but that felt natural when it came to her. "Thank you, my love. It's beautiful, just like you." He kissed her forehead, but as he set her down, he noticed Jamie standing not far away, watching the scene. A pang of unease washed over Gustavo, though he couldn't explain why. Jamie quickly averted his gaze, pretending to adjust a flower bed, but the feeling that something was amiss lingered. However, Gustavo pushed the thought aside. He was a practical man, used to dealing with numbers and contracts, not vague intuitions. To him, it was simply the result of his ever-alert mind, shaped by years of distrust in the business world. "Stop imagining things," he told himself. The day went on as usual, like so many others at the Alcantara mansion. Gustavo spent hours in video conference meetings while Sophia played in the gardens under the watchful eyes of the staff. Jamie continued his work in silence, almost invisible, except when Sophia ran to him to show off some treasure she'd found: a shiny rock, a small insect, or a heart-shaped leaf. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Gustavo sat on the terrace with a glass of whiskey in hand, gazing at the horizon. Sophia was playing with a doll on the swing by the big fig tree in the center of the garden. Jamie, quietly, was gathering his tools to wrap up for the day. Gustavo glanced at the gardener once more, feeling that inexplicable unease creeping back. He shook his head and took a sip of whiskey, trying to brush the thought away. Little did he know, that would be the last peaceful day of his life. The clock in Gustavo's bedroom read 6:45 a.m. when he woke up that Saturday. The soft glow of dawn filtered through the half-open curtains, and an unusual silence hung over the mansion. It was the kind of calm that, for someone used to waking up to Sophia's laughter echoing down the halls or the sound of the kettle in the kitchen, felt almost unsettling. She must be sleeping deeply today, he thought as he stretched and slipped on an immaculate linen robe. He had promised to take her to the water park that afternoon, and Sophia had been counting down the days with the excitement only a child could muster. When he reached her bedroom door, Gustavo knocked lightly. "Princess, time to wake up. We got a big day ahead." Silence. He frowned and slowly opened the door. The bed was empty, the covers tossed aside as if she had left in a hurry. A chill ran down his spine. Sophia never left her room without first running to give him a morning hug. "Sophia," he called louder, his voice tinged with growing concern. "Sweetheart, where are you?" No response. He walked to the bathroom adjoining her room, but it was empty. Sophia's slippers were still in their usual spot beside the bed. A weight began to settle in his chest. His heart raced as he hurried into the hallway. "Maria! Pedro! Has anyone seen Sophia?" His voice echoed through the mansion's walls, drawing the staff out of their usual posts. Maria, the middle-aged housekeeper who had worked with the family for years, appeared at the end of the hall with a worried expression. "Mr. Gustavo, isn't she in her room?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "No. Look for her. Now!" Gustavo commanded, his voice filled with urgency and a hint of desperation. As the staff scattered around the mansion, Gustavo rushed down the stairs, taking long strides, checking the playroom, the kitchen, the office, any place Sophia might be. Nothing. His mind began conjuring unlikely scenarios. Maybe she had gone to the garden, as she sometimes did in the mornings. He ran to the veranda door and called out her name. "Sophia, daughter, answer me." Only the sound of birds responded. That's when Maria reappeared, this time visibly distressed. "Sir, I saw the girl earlier, around 6. She was near the swing in the garden. I thought she wanted to enjoy the fresh air before breakfast." She hesitated, looking at the ground as if afraid to say something that might make things worse. "But I haven't seen her since." Gustavo's blood ran cold. He sprinted to the garden as if his life depended on it. The grass was still damp with morning dew. The swing under the large fig tree swayed gently in the breeze, but Sophia wasn't there. He called her name repeatedly, his voice starting to crack, but the garden seemed deserted. An older gardener, who tended to the greenhouse area, approached cautiously. "Mr. Alcantara, Jamie didn't show up for work this morning. I thought he'd been given the day off or something." Jamie. The name hit Gustavo like an alarm. The new gardener, so reserved, so mysterious. Where was he? And why wasn't Sophia anywhere to be found? "Search every corner of the property." Gustavo shouted at the staff. "And someone called the police. Now!" Within minutes, police cars arrived at the mansion, their lights flashing red and blue. Uniformed officers poured through the gates and began combing the area. One of them, Inspector Alvaro Costa, a sturdy man with a stern expression, approached Gustavo in the garden. "Mr. Alcantara, I understand you're in shock, but we need details. Is there any chance your daughter might have left the property on her own?" "No," Gustavo snapped. "She would never leave without telling me. Something's happened. I'm sure of it." The inspector nodded, maintaining a calm and professional demeanor. "All right. You mentioned a gardener who's absent. Is there anything about him that strikes you as suspicious? Gustavo hesitated. He didn't want to admit that he had ignored the strange feelings Jamie had given him from the start. He's new here. I don't know much about him. But now that I think about it, he always seemed to be near my daughter. Maybe too close. The police exchanged glances. Alvaro jotted down the gardener's name in his notebook. We'll investigate. Mr. Alcantara, we'll need a list of your employees and their information to help with the search. As the officers began their investigation, Gustavo stood frozen in the garden, feeling the weight of guilt settling on his shoulders. How had he not noticed anything? How had he allowed something like this to happen under his own roof? A few minutes later, Alvaro returned, his tone carrying a deeper sense of concern. Mr. Alcantara, we've searched the house and the immediate perimeter. There's no sign of your daughter, and the gardener Jamie seems to have disappeared as well. This could be a coincidence, but coincidence? Gustavo shouted, his eyes blazing with anger. He took my daughter. He kidnapped her. I don't care about the reason. Find him. Do whatever it takes. As the police organized to expand the search beyond the mansion's grounds, Gustavo walked to Sophia's room. He needed to feel her presence somehow. The unmade bed, the toys scattered across the floor, the soft scent of lavender in the air. Everything looked the same, yet everything was wrong. The room felt empty. Sophia's absence was an open wound. I will find you, Sophia, he whispered into the silence, his fists clenched. Whoever dared to take you from me will pay for this. Chaos had taken over the mansion. Officers roamed the hallways, questioning staff and turning every corner upside down in search of clues. Police helicopters hovered above the property, while sniffer dogs combed the grounds, but without success. Gustavo felt on the verge of collapse, his nerves shattered. Sitting in the leather chair in his office, he stared into the void, his face buried in his hands. With every passing minute, dread grew, like an endless shadow. Mr. Alcantara? Inspector Alvaro's deep voice called from the doorway, snapping Gustavo back to reality. We haven't found anything conclusive outside yet, but we need to keep searching the house. It's possible something was left behind. What kind of something? Gustavo asked, standing abruptly, as if clinging to a sliver of hope. Notes, items out of place. Anything that might suggest a motive or point to your daughter's whereabouts. Nodding, Gustavo led the officers to Sophia's room, where they began to examine every detail with clinical precision. Gustavo felt like an intruder in a space that had once been a sanctuary of love and innocence. He watched as the officers opened drawers and sifted through toys, while Maria, the housekeeper, stood in the background, her eyes filled with tears. "Excuse me, sir," said a young officer from inside Sophia's closet. "There's something here." The officer held a crumpled piece of paper, as if it had been left in a hurry. Gustavo ran to him, snatching the paper from his hands. It was a note. His heart raced as he read the words, "She is with me, but I'm not the villain you think I am. The truth will come out. Trust in destiny." The signature was clear, though almost informal. "Jamie." Gustavo stared at the paper, a mix of anger and confusion washing over him. "Bold! That bastard is far too bold," he shouted, throwing the note onto the table. "He kidnapped my daughter and still has the nerve to write something like this? What does he want? Money? Revenge?" Inspector Alvaro picked up the paper calmly, studying every detail as if searching for a hidden meaning. "The tone is peculiar, I must admit. If it were just a ransom demand, it would be straightforward. This feels personal. He's after more than money, Mr. Alcantara. He wants to play games with me," Gustavo growled, pacing back and forth in Sophia's room. "But he has no idea who he's dealing with. I will destroy him." Maria, who hadn't said a word since the search began, finally stepped forward, nervously clutching her apron. "Mr. Gustavo, forgive me for speaking out, but Jamie was always kind to the girl. He seemed to care for her, but he never struck me as dangerous." "Are you defending him, Maria?" Gustavo roared, turning to face the housekeeper. "He took Sophia. Kindness doesn't matter when someone commits a crime like this." The woman stepped back, frightened. "I only meant that maybe he has another reason. Maybe he doesn't want to hurt the girl." "What does he want, then? A medal for being a good gardener?" "That doesn't matter. He took her from me. If Sophia isn't home by the end of the day, I won't be held accountable for what I do." Gustavo felt on the verge of a breakdown, but he was interrupted by the insistent ringing of his phone. It was an unknown number. He hesitated, staring at the screen as if it were a bomb. With trembling hands, he answered. "Hello?" His voice was heavy with tension. On the other end, there was no static, no background noise, just silence. And then a female voice, cold, almost serene, spoke. "Destiny has a peculiar way of revealing the mistakes of the past, Mr. Alcantara." "Who are you?" Gustavo demanded. "What do you know about my daughter?" The woman ignored his question. "Don't you see? This isn't just about her. It's about you, about what you've done." The call ended abruptly. The room seemed to spin around Gustavo. He felt dizzy, as if the ground beneath his feet was about to give way. "About me? What does that mean?" he murmured more to himself than to the others. Alvaro, who was watching him closely, placed a firm hand on Gustavo's shoulder. "Mr. Alcantara, could this Jamie have any prior connection to you? Any sort of disagreement? Someone you might have wronged in the past?" "No," Gustavo snapped impatiently. "I've never even heard of this man before hiring him. He was just an employee. Of course, he might have made up some story to justify this madness, but I never had anything to do with him." "Are you certain, Mr. Alcantara?" Alvaro pressed, narrowing his eyes. "Because from the tone of this letter and the phone call, it sounds personal. Something that isn't just about Sophia, but about you." The inspector's words echoed in Gustavo's mind as he sat on the edge of Sophia's bed, his elbows resting on his knees. His head was a storm of thoughts. The past. What part of his past could possibly be connected to Jamie? He tried to remember, but the life Gustavo had lived was full of cold-blooded decisions, sacrifices he had justified as necessary for his success. Businesses ruined, people discarded. Could Jamie be a ghost from one of those decisions? He stared at the letter again. Trust and fate. The words seemed to mock him, dancing before his eyes. "Jamie," Gustavo whispered, his fists clenched. "I will find him, and when I do, he's going to tell me everything. Everything." Inspector Alvaro ordered the police to dig into Jamie's records immediately, combing through his life for any link to Gustavo. Meanwhile, Gustavo picked up the note once more, staring at the uneven handwriting. He couldn't shake the feeling that this message was more than just a threat. It was a riddle, and he deeply feared what he might uncover by solving it. Gustavo's office, usually a space of cold, calculated decisions, now felt like a stage for despair. He paced back and forth, the sound of his footsteps echoing off the marble floor. Every new piece of information about Jamie was like a piece of a puzzling jigsaw, one Gustavo dreaded completing. Inspector Alvaro entered, carrying a thick folder. His expression was grim, the look of someone who had uncovered something important and possibly unsettling. "Mr. Alcantara," he began, placing the folder on the mahogany desk. "We've managed to gather some information on Jamie. What we found might be revealing." Alvaro hesitated, as if unsure how to begin. "Just say it already." Gustavo burst out, his patience wearing thin. He needed answers, not delays. Alvaro opened the folder, spreading out photographs and documents. His full name is Jamie Correa. He grew up in an orphanage in the countryside. No family records. He He was arrested twice in his youth for involvement in fights and public disturbances. Nothing too serious, but enough to leave a mark. He's worked as a construction helper, security guard, and gardener in recent years. However, there's something peculiar. The inspector picked out a specific sheet of paper and placed it in front of Gustavo. It was a bank transfer record. 3 years ago, Jamie made a significant donation to the orphanage where he grew up. We're talking about something around 300,000 reis. Gustavo frowned, confused. 300,000 reis? How could a gardener have that kind of money? That's exactly what I wondered. Alvaro leaned forward, crossing his arms. It raises a lot of suspicion, but there's more. We found out that the orphanage in question has a complicated history. About 8 years ago, it faced a serious financial crisis, with accusations of embezzlement of funds meant for underprivileged children. Hearing this, Gustavo felt a chill run down his spine. He shifted in his chair, as if something in his mind was starting to connect. "And what does this have to do with me?" he asked, though he already had a feeling about the answer. Alvaro held his gaze steady. The orphanage was part of a charity project funded by the Alcantara Foundation. Your foundation? Gustavo's heart skipped a beat. His mind went back to those years, a time when the Alcantara Foundation was managed by a team of ambitious executives. He himself had rarely gotten involved in the details of the charity operations. They were just distractions, activities meant to polish the public image of his company. Back then, accusations had surfaced about funds being misused, but Gustavo had been cleared of any wrongdoing. A scapegoat, a mid-level manager, had taken the blame, and the case was closed. Gustavo barely remembered it. "Do you think Jamie has something to do with this?" Gustavo asked, his voice now quieter, almost hesitant. Alvaro tilted his head thoughtfully. "I'd say it's no coincidence. Jamie grew up in that orphanage. And worse, we found medical records showing he had a younger brother, Miguel. The boy died when he was 8 years old, right during the financial crisis that hit the orphanage. The cause of death? Lack of adequate medical treatment for a chronic illness that could have been managed if the orphanage had had the resources." Alvaro's words hit Gustavo like a weight. He felt the ground disappear beneath him, a wave of dizziness taking over. "Are you saying that his brother's death is tied to my foundation? To my decisions?" "I'm saying that, to him, it might be." Alvaro crossed his arms, his tone neutral but sharp. "Whether you were directly responsible or not, he may blame you for what happened. And now, he has your daughter. This might be his way of settling the score." Gustavo slammed his fist on the table, his face red with anger and frustration. "This is absurd. He has no right to mess with my family. I didn't even know who he was." "It might be true, Mr. Alcantara, but sometimes that doesn't matter to someone who carries this kind of resentment," Alvaro replied calmly. For Jamie, this might have been personal for years. Before Gustavo could respond, the phone on his desk vibrated. He glanced at the screen. It was an anonymous number again. With his blood boiling, he answered. "Jamie," he shouted immediately, unable to hold back. On the other end, a low, cold laugh confirmed it was him. "I see you're starting to understand, Gustavo. You dare to call me? Where's my daughter? If you've harmed her, she's safe," Jamie interrupted, his voice steady. "Safer than she ever was with you. This isn't a negotiation, Gustavo. This is justice." "Justice? You kidnapped an innocent child. Is that what you call justice?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Jamie spoke again, his voice was filled with restrained emotion. "What do you know about innocence, Gustavo? My brother was innocent. He died because your foundation stole the only chance he had to live. But that never mattered to you, did it? You never cared about what you destroyed to get where you are." Jamie's words hit Gustavo like a punch to the gut. He tried to pull himself together. I didn't know. It was a mistake by others. It had nothing to do with me." "Didn't know?" Jamie laughed again, but this time it was bitter. "Do you think that excuses you?" You created the system that allowed it to happen. You profited from it. It doesn't matter how much you pretend otherwise. I'm here to make sure you see what you've done." Before Gustavo could reply, Jamie continued, "She's safe, Gustavo, and I'll return her when the time is right. But before that, you're going to face what you left behind. You'll stare into the abyss you created." The call ended. Gustavo stood there holding the phone, frozen. Jamie's words echoed in his mind. He looked at Alvaro, his eyes filled with a mix of despair and anger. "I can't wait. We have to find him. Now." Alvaro nodded. "We'll intensify the search. But, Mr. Alcantara, I have to ask, is there more in your past that you haven't told us? Because it seems like Jamie is digging deep." Gustavo didn't answer. He no longer knew what might be buried in his past that could come back to haunt him. And worse, he didn't know how far Jamie would go. The night dragged on, but Gustavo couldn't close his eyes. The mansion's office was dark, lit only by the glow of his computer screen. He kept replaying the facts coming to light. Like pieces of a macabre puzzle, he was reluctant to piece together. Was Jamie right? Had he truly contributed to a chain of events that cost a child their life? He tried to rationalize, but guilt began creeping through the cracks in his conscience. The office door opened, and Alvaro walked in with a stern expression. "We've got more information, Mr. Alcantara. We need to talk." "Go on," Gustavo said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. Alvaro placed an envelope on the desk, heavy with papers and photographs. "We dug deeper into Jamie's past. At the same time, we uncovered records about the scandal involving your foundation years ago. You need to see this." He opened the envelope and spread the documents on the table. Gustavo's heart raced as he recognized the headings. They were internal records from the Alcantara Foundation. "This was 8 years ago," Alvaro began. "The Alcantara Foundation received a major government contract to manage a charity fund for orphanages. What we found are clear indications that the money was embezzled. Reports were forged. Funds meant for purchasing medicine and improving facilities were diverted to third-party accounts." "I was already cleared of that," Gustavo interrupted, his voice rising. "Everything was investigated. It was the administrator's responsibility at the time. I didn't even know it was happening." "I understand, Mr. Alcantara," Alvaro said, patient but firm. "But there's something else you need to see." He slid a photo toward Gustavo. It showed a boy with a thin face and large eyes, hugging a smaller boy with a shy smile. In the background was an old building, the orphanage. "That's Jamie, with his brother Miguel," Alvaro said. Jamie was 16 when Miguel died. According to the medical records, Miguel suffered from a chronic lung condition. He needed expensive medication and supplemental oxygen that the orphanage couldn't afford when the funds disappeared. Jamie blamed the system, but more specifically, he blamed you. Gustavo stared at the photo, his breathing heavy. I didn't know this was happening," he repeated, but now his voice carried less conviction. He knew his deliberate neglect of the details and the charity projects had allowed others to act unchecked. He knew he had always cared more about numbers than people. "This explains Jamie's motive," Alvaro continued, "but it still doesn't fully explain his involvement with your daughter. Why Sophia? Why now?" Before Gustavo could respond, his phone vibrated. Another message from an unknown number. He opened it immediately. It was a video. The footage started shaky, as if the camera were being adjusted. Then the image steadied. Sophia appeared, sitting on the grass in a flower-filled field, holding a bouquet. She looked peaceful, as if playing and unaware of any danger. "Daddy, look, I made this for you," she said, looking directly at the camera with her innocent smile. Gustavo felt a lump in his throat, his heart pounding. The camera then panned, revealing Jamie. He looked directly into the lens, his eyes hard but devoid of apparent malice. "She's safe, Gustavo," he said. "I'm not a monster, but you need to understand something. This isn't just about justice. It's about truth. Before the video ended, Jamie added, "Tomorrow, you'll know everything. Meet me. No police. Just you." The video cut off abruptly. Gustavo stared at his phone, as if expecting something else to appear. "He wants me to go to him," he said, more to himself than to Alvaro. "This could be a trap," the inspector replied. "You can't go alone. We need a team ready to step in." "No." Gustavo suddenly stood up, his eyes burning with determination. "I'm going alone. If he wants to talk to me, then he'll deal with me. She's my daughter. I won't risk her getting hurt because you decided to turn this into a confrontation." Alvaro hesitated but nodded. "If that's the case, we need to prepare. I want men positioned nearby. We won't act unless you give the signal." "Do whatever you want," Gustavo muttered, turning his attention back to the video, which he watched on repeat. Every time he saw Sophia's face, something inside him broke. The next morning, Gustavo received an address. An abandoned chapel in the countryside, surrounded by dense woods. He drove there alone, just as Jamie had instructed. The silence in the car was deafening, broken only by the hum of the engine and the sound of the wind. His mind wandered to moments with Sophia. How she used to love drawing beside him while he worked, or how she always held his hand before falling asleep. The thought of losing his daughter consumed him. But there was something else eating away at him, the uncertainty of what he was about to uncover. When he arrived at the chapel, the place was deserted. The building was in ruins, with broken windows and vines creeping up the stone walls. The air smelled of damp earth, as if it had recently rained. Gustavo parked the car and stepped out, each step feeling as heavy as if he were carrying the weight of the world. Inside, he saw Jamie waiting in the center of the empty hall. Jamie stood with his hands in his pockets. He looked tired but resolute. When he saw Gustavo, he didn't react immediately. "You came," Jamie said, breaking the silence. "Good. I think it's time you learned the truth." Gustavo clenched his fists, struggling to control his anger. "Where is Sophia?" "She's safe," Jamie replied calmly. "But before I give her back, you need to understand. This isn't just about her. It's about you, Gustavo. About your mistakes. About the lives you destroyed without even realizing it." Jamie took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on Gustavo. "The girl you love, the one you protect like she's all you have, Sophia, she's not just your daughter." Gustavo frowned. "What are you talking about?" Jamie stepped forward. "She's also my niece. And that, Gustavo, is something you can't ignore anymore." The statement hung in the air like a silent explosion, leaving Gustavo frozen. His mind raced, struggling to process what he had just heard. The silence in the chapel seemed to absorb every sound. Gustavo stared at Jamie, motionless, as if every word he had just heard was a dagger lodged in his mind. He blinked several times, trying to organize his thoughts, but the declaration kept echoing in his head. "Sophia is also my niece. This is madness," Gustavo finally managed to say, his voice hoarse, his fists clenched. "You don't know what you're talking about." Jamie didn't move. His eyes carried a mix of restrained anger and sadness, an expression Gustavo couldn't decipher. "I know exactly what I'm talking about. And deep down, Gustavo, so do you." "Enough of this," Gustavo shouted, stepping forward. "If this is some kind of game, you're going to tell me now where my daughter is. Leave Sophia out of this. Sophia has never been out of this." Jamie shouted back, his voice echoing off the chapel walls. He took a deep breath, trying to regain control. "Don't you get it? She's the link between us, Gustavo. She's the living proof of the decisions you made in the past, decisions that destroyed lives." Gustavo shook his head, refusing to accept what he was hearing. "You're making this up, twisting the story to justify what you've done. Sophia is my daughter, mine and Ana Luisa's. There's nothing more to say." Jamie let out a bitter laugh, leaning slightly forward. Ana Luisa was never Sophia's biological mother, and you know that. Do you need me to refresh your memory? Over 8 years ago, you had an affair with Beatrice. Remember her, Gustavo? The name hit Gustavo like a punch to the gut. Beatrice. For a moment, he felt as if the room around him was spinning. Yes, he remembered. Beatrice, a young, talented, ambitious assistant who had worked at his company for just over a year. They had had a brief affair, something he had dismissed as an insignificant distraction, just like so many others in his life. But she had disappeared from his life as quickly as she had entered it. Beatrice, Gustavo murmured, her name escaping his lips like a confession. What does she have to do with this? Jamie stepped closer, his eyes locked onto Gustavo's. She got pregnant by you. But when she told you, you rejected her. You said you weren't willing to destroy your family, and that what you two had was a mistake. She begged for your help, but you ignored her, Gustavo. You left her completely alone. And do you know what happened after that? Gustavo felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. He wanted to deny it, but he couldn't. Flashes of memory came to him. The argument, Beatrice's pleas, the cold way he dismissed her. This can't happen. Not now. I already have a family. He remembered saying, back then believing he was protecting Ana Luisa and his reputation. He hadn't thought of Beatrice again after that. Jamie continued, his voice heavy with pain. Beatrice died during childbirth. You refused to help, and she was forced to have Sophia alone in a public hospital without the resources she needed. And do you know who had to take on the responsibility after she died? Me. You. Gustavo could barely say the word, his mind reeling. Yes, me. Jamie pointed at himself. Beatrice was my sister. I was the only family she had. And when she died, they left Sophia at the orphanage where I grew up. I was in another state working, trying to build a life, and by the time I got back, my niece was already there, just another abandoned child. I tried to take care of her, but I couldn't. I had nothing. Jamie's voice broke for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. I never forgave myself for not being able to get her out of there. But months later, you showed up, Gustavo. You and your wife adopted Sophia, like she was some kind of blessing that fell into your lap. You didn't even know who she really was. Gustavo stepped back, stunned. He remembered the day Ana Luisa suggested adoption. At the time, he was trying to make up for the problems in their marriage, mainly caused by his emotional absence and the affairs Ana Luisa never found out about. He agreed to adopt Sophia as an attempt to start fresh, but never looked deeply into her background. This doesn't make sense. How can you be sure? Jamie stared straight into Gustavo's eyes, his gaze sharp as a blade. I've always known, but I could never get close enough. When I found out Sophia had been adopted by you, it broke me. The man who destroyed my family, who rejected my sister, was now raising her daughter as if she were a prize to make up for his own mistakes. It felt like some cruel twist of fate. Gustavo felt the weight of every word, as if carrying stones in his chest. He dropped to his knees, his face pale. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. You didn't know because you never cared enough to find out. Jamie shouted, his voice shaking with emotion. You've lived your life surrounded by wealth and power, stepping on people without ever looking back. But I won't let you continue. Sophia deserves to know where she came from. She deserves to know who you really are. Gustavo lifted his eyes to Jamie, tears burning at the corners. He wanted to speak, but the words wouldn't come. All he could do was feel the weight of years of neglect and selfishness finally collapsing upon him. Jamie took a deep breath, quickly wiping his eyes before continuing. She's out there, Gustavo. She's fine. I never wanted to hurt her, but I needed to make you understand. I need you to see what you've done. I need you to change before she grows up and sees the kind of man you truly are. Gustavo remained on his knees, staring blankly at nothing. The truth had stripped him of any armor he still carried. He felt the emptiness of his actions, the abyss he had dug over the course of his life. "I just want my daughter back," he whispered, finally broken. "Please. Sophia is all I have." Jamie stayed silent for a moment, observing the man before him. For the first time, he saw something different in Gustavo's eyes. Something that looked like regret. Or maybe something close to it. "You'll have her back," Jamie said finally, his voice firm but without the hardness it had before. "But this isn't the end, Gustavo. You owe a debt to the past, and I'll make sure you pay it." The chapel doors creaked lightly in the wind, and the scent of old wood and dampness filled the air. Jamie stood a few steps away from Gustavo, who was still on his knees, his eyes lost somewhere on the floor. The truth Jamie had just laid out for him was like thunder echoing through his mind. The man who had believed for decades that he controlled everything was now crumbling under the weight of his choices. Jamie, fists clenched, took a step forward, his eyes still locked on Gustavo. "Now you know, Gustavo. Sophia isn't just your daughter. She's my niece, my sister's blood, the blood of someone you discarded like trash." Gustavo slowly lifted his gaze. At first, his eyes were empty, but soon the look of despair gave way to a chaotic rage. He stood up, staggering, pointing a finger at Jamie. "And you think you could just kidnap my daughter to throw that in my face? You think you can mess with my life as if you're the keeper of the truth? I made mistakes in the past, yes, but that doesn't give you the right to steal my family." Jamie shook his head, frustration evident on his face. "Steal? Is that what you think I'm doing, Gustavo? You already stole Sophia's chance to know her true origins. You stole my sister's life. You stole my brother Miguel's future when you let that institution spiral into chaos. And now, you want to pretend you're innocent, the victim in all of this? That's not how it works. You don't understand." Gustavo shot back, trying to regain control of the conversation, his voice still filled with anger and desperation. "I didn't know. I didn't know about Beatrice. I didn't know she had died, that Sophia was my biological daughter. I'm not a monster, Jamie. I wouldn't have let this happen if I had known." Jamie stepped forward, anger radiating from his every movement. "You didn't know because you chose not to know, Gustavo. You lived on top of the mountain, looking down on the world, thinking you could toss people aside like disposable pieces on a game board. And you know what's ironic? It took a child, the very one you neglected from the start, to make you see the damage you caused." Gustavo didn't respond immediately. He began pacing the chapel, his footsteps echoing through the empty space. His hands trembled, but he kept them firmly clasped behind his back, as if trying to reclaim some remnant of his former imposing demeanor. After a few moments of silence, he finally spoke, though this time his voice was low, almost a whisper. "Sophia is all I have. Ever since Ana Luisa died, she's been my only reason to keep going. I know I made mistakes, but I can't lose my daughter." Jamie scoffed, letting out a short, bitter laugh. "You see her as your daughter because she fills the void you created yourself. But you never asked who she really is. You never cared to know where she came from. She's not just your possession, Gustavo. She's a person with her own story, her own past, one you've ignored." Suddenly, the chapel door creaked. Both Gustavo and Jamie froze. For a moment, they turned toward the door in unison, but Gustavo was the first to react. He rushed over, and there she was, Sophia, with her wide, innocent eyes holding the bouquet of flowers from the video. She glanced at her father and then at Jamie, puzzled by the tension in the air. "Here I am, Daddy." She ran into Gustavo's arms, smiling as if nothing had happened. Gustavo knelt down, clutching her as though his life depended on it. Tears streamed down his face as he held Sophia tightly, as if trying to shield her from the entire world. My love, are you okay? Did he hurt you? Did he do anything to you?" His voice cracked, overwhelmed with emotion. Sophia frowned, clearly confused. "No, Daddy. Uncle Jamie was really nice. He gave me flowers and played with me. He said he wanted to talk to you. That's all." "Uncle Jamie?" Gustavo repeated, his blood running cold. He looked at Jamie, who now seemed uncomfortable with the title. "She calls you uncle?" Jamie sighed, crossing his arms. "She doesn't know, Gustavo. She doesn't know who I really am. I didn't tell her. That's something you need to do." Gustavo blinked in surprise. "Why didn't you tell her? If it's so important that she knows the truth, why didn't you say anything?" Jamie averted his gaze for a moment, taking a deep breath. When he looked back at Gustavo, his expression was a mix of anger and pain. "Because it's not something she should hear from me. I'm not the one who should explain why her mother died alone, abandoned. I'm not the one who should carry that guilt." Sophia looked between the two men, intrigued. "Daddy, why are you fighting? Did I do something wrong?" "No, Princess," Gustavo quickly replied, gently stroking his daughter's hair. "You didn't do anything wrong. None of this is your fault." He held her even tighter, as though fearing the world around them might crumble once again. Jamie took a few steps back, crossing his arms again. "She's just a child, Gustavo. A child who deserves the truth. But you can't keep pretending she's just a way to fix your mistakes. She deserves more than that. She deserves to know who she really is." Sophia looked up at Jamie with an innocent smile. "Uncle Jamie, are you going to live with us now? It was fun playing with you." Jamie froze for a moment, visibly moved by the girl's words. He lowered his head, struggling to keep his emotions in check. I don't know, Sophia. That's not up to me." Gustavo felt the weight of those words. He realized in that moment that a bond had already formed between Sophia and Jamie, however brief and unusual it might have been. The girl seemed to trust him, and that hurt Gustavo as much as it comforted him. He looked at Jamie, this time with less anger and more profound sadness. "You said I need to tell her the truth. But how? How can I tell her something that will shatter her world? That will make her hate me?" "This isn't about you," Jamie replied firmly. "It's about her. If you truly love her, Gustavo, you'll find a way to tell her the truth. And then you'll make peace with the past. For her, and for yourself." Jamie's words hit Gustavo like an unavoidable sentence. He knew Jamie was right, and he knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The drive back to the mansion was made in complete silence. Gustavo was at the wheel, while Sophia sat in the back seat, humming a cheerful tune, blissfully unaware of the tension in the air. Her smile and innocence felt like knives to Gustavo. He could feel that he was about to take something precious and irreplaceable from her, the perfect image she had of her father. Jamie, on the other hand, followed at a distance on a simple motorcycle. Gustavo had insisted that he leave, but Jamie, without saying a word, had simply started his bike and waited for them to go. He knew there was still a conversation left to have. Now that the truth had been uncovered, the consequences still had to be faced. When they arrived at the mansion, Gustavo carried Sophia up to her room, despite her protest that she was too big for that. He gently placed her in bed, tucked her in, and smoothed her hair with tenderness. Sophia looked up at him with her big, curious eyes. "Are you sad, Daddy?" she asked. Gustavo forced a smile, even as his chest felt heavy. "No, my love. I'm just tired. It's been a long day. It was fun," Sophia replied excitedly. "Uncle Jamie is so nice. He taught me how to make flower crowns. Did you see the one I made?" "I did. It's beautiful," he said, his voice wavering slightly. Sophia yawned and nestled into her pillow. "Good night, Daddy. I love you. I love you too, Princess. More than anything in this world." He kissed her softly on the forehead and turned off the light. When he closed her bedroom door, he stayed in the hallway, leaning against the wall. It felt like his heart was caught in a vice, tightening with every breath. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the thought that telling her the truth would cost him the person he loved most in the world. Gustavo found Jamie waiting in the living room, standing near the glass window overlooking the garden. He was quiet, watching the moon's reflection on the pool. When he heard Gustavo's footsteps, he turned slowly. "And now?" Gustavo asked, tired but without the aggression from before. "What do you want from me?" "I already got what I wanted," Jamie replied, crossing his arms. "I wanted you to know the truth. I wanted you to face what you did." "Congratulations," Gustavo retorted, sarcasm slipping out unintentionally. "Now I know. But what am I supposed to do with that? Do you want me to tell her? Do you want me to say her mother died because I was a coward? That she's the result of the worst mistake of my life?" Jamie stepped forward, his eyes hard. "Don't you dare call her a mistake. Sophia is the only good thing that came out of all this. And yes, she deserves to know. But not just any way. You need to own up to what you did, Gustavo. Not for me, not for Beatrice, but for her." Jamie's words hit like a slap. Gustavo knew he was right. He took a deep breath and sank onto the couch, running his hands over his face. "Do you think it's easy? Do you think I could just sit down with an 8-year-old and say, 'Your whole life has been built on a lie'? I don't even know where to start." Jamie stayed silent for a few moments, then sighed. "It won't be easy. None of this has been easy for me either. But the truth always finds a way, Gustavo. It's better for her to hear it from you than from someone who doesn't love her." The words hung in the air. Gustavo knew Jamie was speaking from experience. He could see it in the man's face. Those wounds were still raw. The loss of his brother, his sister, and years of buried pain now rising to the surface. "I'm not a good man, Jamie," Gustavo finally admitted, his voice low and heavy with regret. "I never have been. My whole life, I've been driven by ambition. I've done things I'm not proud of and ignored others because it was easier. But Sophia, she's the one thing I've done right. I can't lose her." Jamie looked at him for a long moment, weighing his words. Then, he took a deep breath and finally let his shoulders relax. "I'm not here to take her away from you, Gustavo. I never was. No matter how angry I am at you, I never wanted to hurt Sophia. She loves you, and despite everything, you've taken good care of her. But now that you know the truth, you have a chance to do things differently. Don't waste it." Gustavo remained silent, staring at the floor. Jamie's words echoed in his mind, but he knew the path to forgiveness, not just Sophia's, but his own, would be long and painful. Jamie took a few steps toward the door. "I'm leaving. My part is done. The rest is up to you." "Wait," Gustavo called out before he could leave. Jamie stopped, but didn't turn around. "You care about her, don't you? You really care about Sophia." "More than anything," Jamie replied, turning slightly to look at Gustavo. "She's the last piece of my sister that still exists. I never wanted to take her from you, but I had to make sure she wasn't just another victim of your mistakes." Gustavo nodded slowly. "Then stay. Help me fix this. Help me tell her the truth. Maybe you could be a part of her life too." Jamie stared at him, surprised. He hadn't expected those words, but he saw the sincerity in Gustavo's eyes. After a few moments of hesitation, he nodded. "For her, not for you." The two men stood in silence, a quiet understanding passing between them. For the first time, there seemed to be a bridge, fragile, but possible. between Jamie's anger and Gustavo's regret. The next morning, Gustavo walked into Sophia's room and sat beside her on the bed. She looked up at him with a sleepy smile. "Good morning, Daddy." He took her hand, his voice trembling slightly. "Princess, I need to talk to you about something very important." Sophia frowned, curious. "Is it about Uncle Jamie?" "Yes," he said, taking a deep breath. "It's about him, and about Mom, and about who you are." As the words began to leave his mouth, Sophia looked at him with innocent eyes, holding his hand tightly. It was hard, but he knew this was the first step toward a more honest future, and perhaps redemption. The days that followed felt like navigating a minefield for Gustavo. Every word he spoke felt like it could set off an explosion. Sitting beside Sophia on the living room couch, he carefully told her the truth he had hidden for so long, even though in reality, he himself had only learned it a few days earlier. "Sophia," he began, holding his daughter's small hands. She looked at him curiously, her head tilted, with no idea the weight of what she was about to hear. "There's something about you, something I've never told you, and I think it's time you knew." Sophia frowned. "What is it, Daddy? Did I do something wrong?" "No, my love. You didn't do anything wrong. But do you remember the story about your mom? How she loved you so much, but went to live with God when you were very little?" Sophia nodded slowly. "Yes, Uncle Jamie said she was special." Gustavo took a deep breath, feeling his heart tighten. "Mommy Ana Luisa loved you, as if you were her own daughter. And you were, but before Mommy Ana, there was someone else. The woman who brought you into this world, who gave you life. Her name was Beatriz." The little girl blinked, clearly trying to process his words. "I had another mommy?" "Yes, my love." Gustavo looked at her, his eyes glistening with tears. "And I wasn't good to her. I made bad choices. I wasn't there for her when she needed me the most. It was the biggest mistake of my life." Sophia stayed quiet for a moment. "And Uncle Jamie? Was he friends with my first mommy?" Gustavo glanced to the side, where Jamie stood leaning against the doorframe. He was watching the scene, arms crossed, but his eyes were filled with restrained sadness. Gustavo nodded slowly, motioning Jamie to come closer. "Uncle Jamie wasn't just a friend, Sophia. He's your mommy Beatrice's brother. That makes him your real uncle." Sophia's eyes widened as she stared at Jamie, astonished. "Really?" Her voice carried genuine surprise. Jamie knelt in front of her, finally joining the conversation. He smiled, though his face still reflected the pain of revisiting the past. "Yes, really," Jamie said gently. "I'm your mommy Beatrice's brother, and when she couldn't stay with you anymore, I tried to look after you as best as I could." Even from afar, Sophia looked back and forth between Jamie and Gustavo, her young mind seemingly struggling to understand what it all meant. Finally, she tilted her head and asked innocently, "So, does that mean I have two daddies and two uncles?" The two men exchanged a glance, one filled with more meaning than words could convey. Jamie gave a small smile and gently stroked Sophia's hair. "Something like that," he said. "But most of all, it means you are very loved." That answer seemed to satisfy Sophia. She smiled, oblivious to the tension lingering between the two men. To her, her family had just grown in an unexpected way. But for Gustavo, that moment was only the beginning of his journey to make amends for the mistakes of his past. The following months brought drastic changes for Gustavo. As he had promised Jamie, he began using his wealth and influence for something that truly mattered. He dissolved the old charity projects of his foundation, stained by past scandals, and launched a new initiative dedicated solely to supporting orphanages and vulnerable children. Reluctantly, Jamie agreed to work alongside him. After all, no one understood better than he did what those children needed. But fate doesn't forgive mistakes without teaching lessons. On a rainy afternoon, Gustavo rushed out of a business meeting, eager to pick up Sophia from school. He was driving fast, as he often did, believing himself above any rules or limits. The wet asphalt, however, proved to be an unforgiving adversary. On a sharp turn on a secondary road, Gustavo lost control of the car. The vehicle skidded and crashed into a pole. When he woke up in the hospital days later, the first face he saw was Jamie's. He was sitting by the bedside, his expression unreadable, a mix of concern and what seemed like resignation. "You survived," Jamie said bluntly. "What would happen?" Gustavo murmured, still groggy. "The car skidded. The doctors say you'll recover, but—" Jamie hesitated before continuing. "You won't walk again. The spinal injury was too severe." The words hit Gustavo like a punch to the gut. He tried to move, but realized he couldn't feel his legs. It was as if half of his body simply didn't exist. "No," he whispered. "This can't be." "I warned you, Gustavo," Jamie said, his voice serious. "You couldn't keep living as if you were untouchable. Fate always collects its dues. And now it has." Anger and frustration consumed Gustavo at first, but they were soon replaced by something deeper. A bitter acceptance. He stared at the blank, white ceiling as tears rolled down his face. At least Sophia is okay. That's all that matters." Jamie nodded slowly. "She's fine. She's strong, just like her mother was. And now, you're going to learn to be strong too. Not for yourself, but for her." Without the mobility that had once symbolized his freedom and control, Gustavo began to see the world from a new perspective. Every movement, every achievement, from learning to use a wheelchair to resuming work at the foundation, became a battle that forced him to confront his own fragility. He started to see the people around him with more humanity, especially Jamie, who became a constant and indispensable presence in his life. Jamie, in turn, began to see Gustavo with less anger and more understanding. Despite everything, he could see Gustavo's genuine effort to change. The man who had once been the source of his pain was transforming. A slow and imperfect process, but an undeniable one. One day, while watching Sophia play in the garden, Jamie broke the silence and said, "You've changed, Gustavo. There's still a long way to go, but I can see the difference." Gustavo, seated in his wheelchair, gave a faint smile. "Maybe that's what destiny intended. To break me so I could learn how to rebuild myself." Jamie looked at him and nodded. "For Sophia's sake, I hope so." The two remained there, side by side, as Sophia ran barefoot across the grass. In that moment, they weren't two men bound by grudges and secrets from the past. They were two pillars of the same family, trying, each in their own way, to hold up something greater than themselves. Months had passed since the accident. Gustavo, now confined to a wheelchair, seemed like a completely different man from the cold, commanding businessman who once dominated boardrooms and dismissed the world around him. The journey he had begun, a path of redemption, humility, and reconnection with his humanity, was far from over, but the change was evident to everyone around him. Most importantly, Sophia remained at the heart of his transformation. It was a sunny afternoon, and the Alcantara mansion, once a symbol of power, had become a more human place. The garden, no longer just a picture-perfect backdrop for lavish gatherings, was alive, full of laughter and children running everywhere. Gustavo had transformed part of the property into a community center for underprivileged children, funding educational projects, therapy sessions, and recreational activities. The new project was managed by Jamie, whose personal experiences made him the ideal person for the role. From the terrace, Gustavo watched Sophia, playing with the other children on the lawn. She ran with a kite, her laughter ringing out like music in the air. Beside him, Jamie stood with his arms crossed, watching the same scene. They didn't speak much to each other, but their coexistence had become surprisingly peaceful, as if the wounds of the past had given way to an unspoken understanding. "She's happy," Gustavo said, breaking the silence, his eyes fixed on Sophia. "That's all that matters now." "Yes," Jamie agreed, though his tone wasn't one of blind approval. "But this is just the beginning. You still have a long way to go, Gustavo. The truth, no matter how hard it is, isn't something you move past overnight. Sophia will grow up. She'll have questions, and you'll have to be ready to answer them." Gustavo nodded slowly, the weight of Jamie's words sinking in. "I know, but for the first time, I feel like I can do it. Like I have the strength to be the father she deserves." Jamie studied him for a moment, assessing him. For the first time, he saw a glimmer in Gustavo's eyes that seemed genuine, a reflection of someone who had finally grasped the meaning of love and responsibility. Jamie stepped away from the railing and sat down in one of the chairs beside Gustavo, something he never would have done a few months earlier. "You're getting there, Gustavo," Jamie said after a long silence. "I won't lie, I never thought I'd say this, but you're starting to become the man Sophia needs." Gustavo looked at Jamie, surprised by the unexpected compliment. He tried to smile, but his voice cracked as he replied, "I could never have done it without you, Jamie. You showed me something no one else had the courage to show before. The truth about who I am, about what I've done." Jamie shrugged, keeping his tone firm, but without the harshness it once held. "I did it for Sophia, and for Beatrice. Not for you. But I'll admit, it's good to see that maybe it was worth it." Later that evening, Gustavo and Sophia were sitting on the couch, surrounded by children's storybooks. It was a ritual he had recently started, a special time just for the two of them, far from work and any distractions. Sophia loved listening to his stories, even when he made up parts of them on the spot, which made her laugh until her stomach hurt. "This time it's my turn to tell a story, Daddy," Sophia said, placing her hands on her hips with the most serious expression she could muster. "Oh, is it? Then tell me, Princess. What story are you going to tell?" Gustavo asked, smiling. Sophia climbed onto his lap, something she still did despite her wheelchair, and something Gustavo always let her do. "It's about a king who did a lot of bad things in the past, but then learned to be good and became the best king in the world." Gustavo felt his eyes fill with tears. He knew Sophia was speaking innocently, but her words hit him like a bittersweet truth. "And how did he learn to be good, my princess?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Because he had people who helped him," Sophia answered without hesitation, looking at him with a big smile. "And because he loved his daughter very much. And love makes people want to be better, doesn't it, Daddy?" Gustavo couldn't respond right away. He just hugged her, pressing his lips to her hair as silent tears streamed down his face. "Yes, my love. Love does that." A year later, the Alcantara Foundation, now renamed the Sophia and Beatrice Foundation, became one of the most respected charitable initiatives in the country. Gustavo had sold part of his fortune to fund social projects, while Jamie managed daily operations. ensuring that the mistakes of the past would never happen again. The foundation helped thousands of vulnerable children, giving them the opportunities that Jamie and Miguel had never had. In the final scene, we see Gustavo and Jamie sitting side by side on a wooden bench, watching Sophia play in a park with other children. The girl ran between swings and slides, her laughter filling the air. "She's special," Jamie said, breaking the silence. "Yes, she is," Gustavo replied with a small smile. He was holding a rosary in his hands, the same one Ana Luisa used when she was alive. "She's the reason for all of this. My second chance." Jamie looked at Gustavo, and for a moment, their eyes met. There was no anger anymore, no guilt, just a shared understanding that no matter how winding the road that had brought them here, they were exactly where they were meant to be. And this time, Jamie said, turning to look at Sophia, "We're not going to waste it." Gustavo nodded, his gaze fixed on his daughter. "No, not this time," as Sophia ran toward them with a radiant smile, calling for them to come play with her. The two men stood up, and together, for the first time, they walked side by side, ready to build a future where the past wouldn't be forgotten, but forgiven. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. These other stories will move you as well. Click to keep watching.